Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. As you may have heard, Progress Texas and our board has endorsed Central Texas entrepreneur and four-term Austin State Representative Vikki Goodwin in her run for Lieutenant Governor of Texas. And that endorsement is due to our board's judgment that Rep. Goodwin is one of the most knowledgeable electeds in the state when it comes to the mechanics of the legislature. We expect her to be key in the rehabilitation of the Lieutenant Governor's office, which, as we've said, is in some ways more powerful than that of the governor. The Lieutenant Governor, of course, sets legislative priorities and oversees the state Senate. We are also impressed with Rep. Goodwin's commitment to the defense and restoration of quality public education in Texas, which is one of many policy areas that has been decimated by decades of Republican rule over our state. She's been doggedly crisscrossing Texas for months now, and we're glad to have a few minutes here to get an update from her from out on the road. State Rep. Vikki Goodwin, welcome back to the pod. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. Tell us where you are. What's happening right now?
So I am up in the DFW area. I've been up here since Monday doing a lot of events. Last night we had a candidate forum with the Texas Coalition of Black Democrats.
Cool.
Did some block walking earlier this week and we'll be up in McKinney this evening.
Give us a kind of an overall update on your campaign activities. Like I say, you've been all over the state. Give us some tales from your adventures and what you're hearing from the huge number of individual Texans that you're getting to meet personally all the time these days.
Yeah, well, not that long ago, there was the March 28th No Kings rally. I was in the Houston area for that, went to several there, and people are really upset at Trump. And of course, Abbott and Patrick are just little minions for Trump.
Right.
And so there's a lot of unhappiness. Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick keep talking about this Texas miracle. And I ask people as I'm on the campaign trail, do you feel like you're living in a miracle? Do you feel like you're doing well? And most people don't. They have stories about their utility prices going up, whether it's electric, whether it's water, maybe it's healthcare issues, not being able to afford health insurance anymore. So there's a lot of people that are unhappy for various reasons. And then, of course, now we're getting into budget season for our school districts. And I've been hearing that school districts are facing bigger deficits yet again this upcoming year, and they're having to cut back. They're having to cut programs, they're having to cut staffing, having to close schools. And of course, the state's trying to take over more and more school districts.
Right.
So we're not seeing the Texas miracle here on the ground.
Right. And we'll get a little bit deeper into education, the voucher thing and all that's been going on. A lot has developed since we last talked to you in that department for sure. But first, here in Texas, progressive people and Democrats we're kind of well trained to keep our optimism cautious in this state. There are all kinds of indicators, though, that this could really be a bang up successful midterm for Democrats. And one of those indicators is a statement from Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick himself that he's worried about an incoming blue wave. We're seeing massive fundraising success, especially with State Rep James Tallarico, who's leading his field nationally. We've seen that surprise win by new State Senator Taylor Ramett in Tarrant County at the end of last year. Rep. Goodwin, we know that you're bullish on how things are going for the ticket at present, but I wonder if you dive in a little deeper into the details of why you think that is. Why should Texas progressives and Democrats be, more optimistic than they're used to being this time around?
Yeah, well, I mean, just look at what happened in the primary. We had 120,000 more Democrats than Republicans show up in this year's primary.
Right.
And since Trump took office this second time around, we have had 30 legislative seats across the country flip from Republican to Democrat and 0 going the other way.
That is wild. Would you say that one more time? I think most people don't know that. Say that one more time.
30 legislative seats throughout the country have flipped from Republican to Democrat just since Trump took office this second time.
That's wild.
And none have gone from Republican to Democrat. That just shows you that people are unhappy with the Republican Party platform, Trump, and leadership right now. none of the Republicans are standing up to Trump. And, these No Kings rallies show us what people think. He is acting like a dictator, like an authoritarian.
Yep.
With the war going on in Iran, there's a
Right.
lot of concern about that as well. And they have, I guess, till the end of April for they get a certain amount of time before Congress has to agree to the war. And they have until the end of April, or they have to get an extension. But a lot of people are unhappy with that because it could just be another never-ending war over in the Middle East.
Right, right. Are you surprised? I'm definitely surprised. I'm curious if you're surprised that there are not more Republicans peeling off from what is just an obvious, complete train wreck at the federal level with Donald Trump. But there seems to largely still be more or less lockstep, at least with key Republican elected officials at the federal level, his cabinet, with the state level here in Texas, especially. They won't break away from him, even though it's just plain as day that it's a complete disaster. Why do you think that is?
Trump is just too powerful. And I would say the same thing about Abbott and Patrick. They just have so much power. They have so much leverage to say, if you don't do what I want you to do, I will kill your legislation. I will pull your funding. Abbott's doing that right here in Texas right now with Houston and Austin, because both Houston and Austin have said what's happening with ICE is untenable. We can't continue to cooperate to the degree that you want us to. And so now they're having their grant funding pulled for public safety. Yeah. And that's the kind of power that Trump, Abbott, Patrick use. Now, I will say individual Republicans, just like in 2018, when I ran the first time for my House seat, I would hear at every event someone say, well, I used to vote Republican, but I can't anymore. I'm hearing that very same thing this year. Particularly at these No Kings rallies, people are showing up who have voted for Trump, and they say, what's happening now? We can't go along with this.
Absolutely. And you touched on this. I want to go a little deeper on the whole ICE ordinance thing. As you mentioned, it started in Houston. It has now expanded to affect Dallas and Austin as well. Governor Abbott holding hostage millions and millions of dollars in key security funding for these cities, not only for usual public safety stuff, police. Governor Abbott is defunding the police at this point, by the way. I must point out. But this is also has to do with safety measures that are being put in place in these big cities for the FIFA World Cup stuff that's coming up, which of course affects, global tourism and billions of dollars at stake that we could be making. And now our own state government is making a mess of security measures that are designed to keep those tourists safe while they're in our country and attending these events. That's become a pawn in this ICE situation, which again, complete train wreck. In your particular case, you are running to make a change that would obviate a lot of these kind of ridiculous problems. Give us your view on that whole situation. And it also makes us think about local control, talking like the Death Star bill. And this kind of relates to all of that, this really, really heavy-handed top-down state control over what's happening in our democratic cities. Talk about that. How would things be different under Democratic leadership, outside of the obvious?
Well, we need to undo the law that forces our local police departments or sheriff's departments to cooperate with ICE, because that's federal. ICE is a federal responsibility. Our local law enforcement have enough to keep them busy ensuring safety within our communities, that they should not be having to take time out of their day to do ICE's job. And just story after story of people that are being pulled off the streets and detained for no reason, for no cause. In fact, I interviewed a woman up here yesterday, Heather Alambarrio, whose husband from Venezuela, his life was threatened. He came here with an asylum case and was working through that process. They thought that he had actually reached the end of the process and he was just about to get his green card when Trump changed the policy regarding Venezuela. So initially he was detained here in the area, but then they moved him to Mississippi. And so further away from his wife and family. She's a school teacher and had to sell her home because it created a financial hardship. They had to hire attorneys, the trauma and the hardship. And this is happening multiple times. We heard about 2 doctors in the Rio Grande Valley. So it's just having impacts in so many different ways that people aren't thinking about. These
Right.
doctors, again, came here in a legal manner, and they were working and serving their communities. And now they've been ripped away from their family, their communities, their livelihood. And so when I'm lieutenant governor, we will make sure that here in Texas, people are being treated. We're following the law. They're being treated humanely. We're not just pulling them off the streets for no reason. You know, these people haven't committed any crimes. And so we're going to make sure that not only are we not cooperating with ICE when they're not following the law, but we are going to make sure that people are getting their due process.
Right. And one of those 2 doctors, Rep. Goodwin, that you're talking about from Venezuela was Physician of the Year at his hospital down in the Rio Grande Valley last year. And so these are like, that really impacts that entire community, where it's a place where medical care is not extensively available. And to pull out one of their, to detain one of their top physicians is just completely ludicrous. So we've been talking lately about how some forms of experience tend to lend themselves to positions of higher importance. For example, we've talked recently on the podcast about Congressman Greg Casar and his experience as an Austin City Councilman, and how that's informed his approach to his job now in D.C. in the U.S. House. We've mentioned before your extensive experience at the Capitol. Talk about what your experience as a state rep, over multiple terms. How does that help you approach the job of lieutenant governor once you're in there? How will it help you hit the ground running?
Well, most people know that it's really hard to pass legislation. So just knowing the process and knowing the people there. So you have to work with your fellow representatives, and in the Senate, of course, work with fellow senators. And I've had that opportunity. I've passed legislation with multiple representatives and multiple senators, so I've built those relationships. But I also know the process. You have to get to know the committee members, and who is on which committee and which bills go through which committee is very important. So knowing the process, knowing the people is really critical. This is not a job that for on-the-job training.
Right.
We need to make sure someone stepping into the role knows how to start on day one, because we have a lot of things that we need to do. A lot of priorities, a lot of systems and agencies in our state are stressed right now, and it's going to take a lot of work to restore sanity.
Right. Restoration of sanity, very important. So into the educational realm, since we've talked to you last, the private school voucher thing has kind of hit the ground and started to roll. And it's starting out much as was expected by a lot of the Democrats, including yourself. Thought it would, as over years and years, multiple sessions of resisting private school vouchers, and that is that wealthier families who already have their kids in private school seem to be the primary people who are interested, the people who are getting signed up, and it's actually turned out worse. And this is a rub that I didn't see coming. Within the program itself, there's an effort underway to exclude religious schools that aren't specifically Christian schools. In particular, Islamic schools have been targeted to be left out of this entire thing. So overarchingly, and you've already mentioned that there's, obviously funding difficulties that are probably directly tied, or at least beginning to be, to the voucher program itself. What happens once you're lieutenant governor with the private school voucher program, and what happens in general with Texas public schools?
My intention when I'm lieutenant governor is to not pass a budget that has any money going to private schools. So by saying that, I will not allow the budget to come to the Senate floor until it has no money for vouchers. That could obviously gum up the works. And so, but I'm going to hold firm to that, because I truly believe that it is not our role to be funding private schools. They have existed for as long as the state's, as long as education has been around.
Sure.
And there's no need for us to fund them with our public dollars. We are underfunding our public schools right now. We need to really address that by making sure that we catch up to inflation, which we never have since 2019, and make sure that we're paying our teachers better. There was a report that our teachers now are making $5,000 less per year than they were a decade ago, when you account for inflation. And so we're losing teachers. We're losing people wanting to go into the profession. And we're over half of our teachers now don't have certification. So most of them are working towards it, but we just need to be able to attract the best and the brightest to be our teachers in our public schools. So that's, my number one issue. And the way to end vouchers is to say that we're not going to fund it. We do need to change the law. We do need to really look at our education code because it's incredibly burdensome for our school districts. Every session I hear, ever since I got into the legislature, that y'all keep passing these laws. You keep passing unfunded mandates. You tell us what we have to do, but you don't give us the money to do it.
Right.
And so I think we need to take a hard look at all these requirements. When we require a school district to send data to the Texas Education Agency, that takes time and it takes personnel. And then what does the Texas Education Agency then do with that data? Oftentimes it just goes into a black hole.
Yeah.
So we're making them do all of this work. We need to really look at our regulation around our public schools and cut it down.
Very, very good. So we've talked education, kind of economics in general. One of those bread and butter issues that you got to be hearing about is healthcare, of course. Horrible shape here in Texas, as we know, in so many different ways. And especially when it comes to stats that we're seeing about Black maternal morbidity lately in Texas, complete travesty. Talk about that in particular and healthcare in general. What could be done about the healthcare situation in Texas under Democratic leadership in Austin?
Yeah, my daughter-in-law just had a baby a month ago, so that's fresh on my mind. And the idea that we are losing women to birth pregnancy complications is just horrific. Right. We can solve that problem, but what we have to do is we have to know what's causing the problem. We should be collecting data. And back in, I think it was 2017, the Texas Legislature got rid of an office within the Health and Human Services Department that collected that data. So we need to reinstate that office so that we can collect data and understand what is happening, why women are dying, both before and after their pregnancy, and then solve the problem. California did that. They did the research. It's not one issue. There's multiple things that are happening to women, but it's also impacting our Black women more so than any other community. And so why is that? Oftentimes I hear that Black women in particular, when they go see the doctor, their issues aren't taken as seriously as they should be. So how do we address that? Maybe it's more training for our doctors and more advocates for our pregnant women.
Well, Rep. Goodwin, as we begin to wind down here, kind of big picture question here. It's occurred to me recently that we have staffers at Progress Texas who have never lived under anything but the Republican regime of, Greg Abbott and Rick Perry before him. What would be the kind of overarching vibe change? Should you become lieutenant governor? Should Gina Hinojosa end up being the governor? If there was a true change, at the Capitol, how would that affect life in general? Just the vibe of things across Texas.
We would pay more attention to what Texans want and need. Supporting our public schools, making sure people can get health care, making sure that they are not living paycheck to paycheck. So that may mean increasing the minimum wage. Also, a turnover of who is running our state agencies and making sure that they are working for the people and better cooperation among government levels. So better cooperation with city and county government. Oftentimes the state tells the cities and counties what they need to do and doesn't participate equally in funding things. Right. So at one point in time, there were more mental health services that the state provided funding for. And more that has been shifted to our counties. And oftentimes it ends up being our jail system. Right. That is where people with mental health crises end up.
Right.
So a lot more cooperation within state government, better leadership within our state agencies, and then setting whole different priorities, which include funding our public schools, fixing our broken healthcare system, making sure people can afford homes, and addressing the planning needs for water and energy.
It's such a hopeful vision, and we're that close. It feels like we're that close. So, Rep. Vikki Goodwin, I really appreciate your time, and thank you for doing what you're doing, and be safe out on the road, and let us know what's going on.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Progress Texas endorsee Vikki Goodwin, I should say. That's the Progress Texas Happy Hour. We appreciate you listening, and we will catch you again next time.